Some preachers say that as Christians, the Bible requires us to pay tithes. Other Christians argue that tithing has no New Testament basis, and we should therefore not be forced to pay it. What should we make of these two camps? Before we even delve into this matter, we need to take in 3 historical facts. 1. There are no historical records of early Christians ever paying tithes. They gave generously for the needs of their fellow brethren, but they never called it a tithe. If tithing was so important, it would have begun with them. Number 2, the first person to ever even mention the idea of tithing to support the church leadership was Cyprian of Carthage, over 200 years after the death of Jesus. Even then, nobody agreed with him. And lastly, it took 700 years after Jesus before tithing began in the church. And even then, the church had to use the threat of violence from the state to get people to pay tithes. So pause and let this sink in. It took 18 generations of Christians before we even began to use the word tithe to refer to any form of giving in the church. How many great-grandfathers do you need to think backwards to find your 18th ancestor? 700 years of Christian who didn't know they needed to pay tithe right after Jesus ascended to heaven. It's quite a number. And just to drive home the point further, no church in Ghana is 700 years old. Think about that. Has it sunk in yet? So what was tithing in the Bible about then? Well, tithing was a practice of taxation in the Old Testament. It was primarily meant to cater for the needs of priests, as well as benefit the stranger, the widow and the fatherless, and the destitute. The priests, because they were dedicated to taking care of the temple, they owned no land, and so they couldn't farm. The stranger, because land was owned by Hebrew families. Immigrants were non-Hebrews, so they couldn't own land to farm on. The widow and the fatherless, because land was inherited by men only. And if a husband died, then the land reverted to his family, leaving widows and their children no land to farm on. The destitute, well, these were poor due to any number of reasons. So whenever anyone tries to guilt you into paying tithes with all sorts of Bible quotations, just remember this. The first 1/3 of Christian history, the 1/3 that sat under the feet of Jesus, Paul, Peter, and the rest of the disciples, never paid a tithe. They gave to meet each other's needs, and that was all. Again, that's 18 generations of Christians immediately after Jesus who never paid tithes or were worried that God will punish them. So now throw them back this challenge. Assuming without admitting that the church leaders represent 25% or 1 out of the 4 classes of beneficiaries who need tithes, can they give you evidence that 75% of the money will go to these 3 other classes of people? If so, you will be willing to consider giving them 10% or even more of your salary or wages. Now that should give them some food for thought. Because at its core, the debate about whether or not to pay tithe is really just a diversion. The real issue is accountability. So even if you are going to pay tithe, it still leaves us with 3 key questions to ponder. Why do our churches not account to its members for the monies they receive from them, whatever name they call it? Why do church members not get a say on how these monies are to be used? And most importantly, why has the church abandoned the example of the early church, where the larger majority of the monies raised went back to the people in the church who needed it? Is the church a family that's supposed to share what it receives, or a business that's supposed to hoard it? Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.